Hello friends, welcome to Raaj Academy. The purpose of this lecture is to demystify critical theories and literature. If you look at traditionally how it is taught in our colleges, even after going through 8 to 10 years of studies, our students are dissatisfied. They don't understand literature, neither theories. Most important, we look at literature as if something divorced from day-to-day life. Philosophy and theory is something just it's for academic purposes, without any day-to-day activities in one's daily life, in social life, in personal life, in academic life, how he or she perceives religion, culture, and different artifacts. Most of these theories have been taught, and literature has been taught to us as if something ideal, utopian perspective, right, which is something, and which is something which is cannot be attainable, right, and which is something which one could only desire. And another thing, the traditional liberal perspective of literature, attaching literature with lot of human values, as if literature would teach something, as if literature would remove all the ills and pains of this world or human being if one takes one shelter under it. So the purpose is to demystify all such perspective and look at literature from layman's perspective, a day-to-day perspective. What is its relevant? How it helps one forming one's idea about life, about culture, about society, and how he or she behaves oneself in this world. The ultimate purpose is not just to debunk some of these artifacts and cultural practices, but even if the circumstances make us to practice those things, at least getting rid of those metaphysical perspective and those utopian perspective from that, and seeing the reality as it is with its historical, political, cultural, hegemonic, and other political social background, and understand its role in day-to-day life. That is the ultimate purpose through which we have started this lecture. So we are going to start with 20th century literary criticism. The first lecture will be on T.S.Eliot. So before we go into detail, all of us must understand Eliot's contribution, Eliot as a poet, as a modernist poet. And in this backdrop, it's very important to understand the social, political, cultural background of Eliot before we get into Eliot as a critic and his role in 1920s. Yeah, the way he helped paved the way for the formation of critical theories in the later decades. Important critical theories which happened in the last 100 years till today, we could say. Even the other important critical theories which are emerging at present, areas like disability studies or men's studies or post-humanism or post-truth or post-modernism or meta-modernism, right, or men's studies or trauma studies or digital humanities, all of these cannot be understood without understanding the most important theories of 50s, 60s, and 70s. And because most of these theories and ideas were as a byproduct or offshoot of important critical theories. And to understand those theories of 1950s and 60s, we have to go back to 1920s. Yeah, 1920s. Before we go and discuss in our next lecture some formalism, Russian formalism, and new criticism or Anglo-American new criticism, we have to deal with some of the important giants of 20th century, right? Like I.A. Richards, F.R. Lewis, and T.S.Eliot. Got it? So keeping that in mind, these are the objective to make it, to let people understand in what way these critical theories are important in that historical context, and what is the importance of that, or in today's perspective, how we are going to look at literature. Literature cannot be dealt with, today you cannot deal with that idealisms of literature, or the traditional definition of literature has, literature teaches life, literature gives you values, it does this, and so many traditional definitions we were taught, right? Today you cannot talk about, yeah, or even when we look at the other discipline, right, compared to literature, or other students, or the faculty members of other discipline, how they look at literature. Yeah, so our perspective has changed, and rather we should rather try to prove them that how literature too, right? And as we proceed, we will know what I mean by literature. But when I say that literature here, it is meaning of MA English or BA English, the traditional definition of literature, right? As we proceed, we might not use the term, right? So in that sense, how relevant it is, right, to a student of maybe computer science, or to a student of philosophy, or to a student of sociology, or to a student of any other discipline, that our discipline is how much more reliable, valuable, and important than the other discipline which they study, right? In fact, how much the whole perspective, is formed because of that. So keeping that in mind, we are going to look at T.S.Eliot, right? And some of these critics which we are going to start with, like Eliot, I.A. Richards, and F.R. Lewis, and new criticism, Anglo-American new criticism, Russian formalism, right, up to 1930s, 40s, and 50s, right? These are pure literary criticism, in a way, literary criticism or literary theory, or the so-called traditional definition of pure literature, what we could call it. Yeah. But after that, as we proceed, we will look at some of the other discipline where the domain, or the area, or our subject or discipline becomes kind of a culture studies, right? Or rather, we could say, till the time, at least, where we would be dealing with a lot of other disciplines too, right? And so in a way, our understanding of the text, or the work, would be not just the written text, not just poem, poetry, or a novel, but all other cultural artifacts, right? It could be games, it could be food, it could be sports, it could be tradition, custom, religion, and all other institutions, and our perspective behind that. Yeah, so that is the mind, that is the purpose. So now when we start with Eliot, right, we have to let's look at T.S.Eliot's. So here the lecture is going to be only on some of his important concepts, right? Eliot as a modernist poet, we all know that, right? And we have to look at the modernist poet, their contribution, yeah, and in a way, what were the historical, political, and social reasons which played an important role in uh, forming of their ideologies, right? So in that sense, we are going to look at Eliot, right? Not in a sense of a traditional definition of, we should not look at Eliot in a sense that, yeah, Eliot was a great, right? Or the traditional definition, whatever we studied. Rather, we should be ready to analyze him even after today, after 100 years, right? Almost, if you look at 1914, when he wrote some of his earliest poem, and if you go with the very famous essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, it's almost 101 year. Rather, last year, it was, Eliot say it almost completed 100 years. So the relevance of those essays and some of those ideas in the last 100 years, right? And how it paved and shaped, paved the way for many other critical theories and ideas. Yeah, I have. So in today's context, we have to look at in what way we are indebted to Eliot, right? Or Eliot or I.A. Richards, and what are the areas or concept or ideas which have become absolute, right? Those idealisms, right, which he might have spoken, right? So keeping in mind the political social background of the time, right, we have to look at them. All right, and in today's perspective also, how whether in what way we can imbibe some of his ideas, or in how it has modified itself, or influenced, right? Influence of Eliot could be seen in structuralist or post-structuralist or all other critical theories, right? And how it paved the way. That is the approach. And understanding some of his critical theories in simple layman's language. Yeah, got it. So that is the ultimate purpose. Got it. And we have started with the we are going to start with the 20th century criticism, Eliot. So the most important aspect is why have we started from 20th century? That is the one aspect we have to remember that. Okay, so we can divide the whole literary criticism and theories into two divisions. One is the traditional and critical, and classical criticism since the time of Aristotle to till today, till maybe the last decades of 19th century, till aesthetic movement, we could say, by 1880s and 1890s, when symbolist movement, impressionistic criticism, and art for art's sake, right? Oscar Wilde, Walter Peter, A.C. Swinburne, all of them were quite popular, right? And we see that in the dramas of works like Oscar Wilde's plays, right? So 1890s, all right. So 20th century, it was a completely, it was a different age. So more than literature, we have to approach. The most important thing is what are the reasons why these 20th century writers or critics, philosophers, they perceived the world in different way. Yeah, we call it a modernist poetry, right? Emergence of all those famous modernist writers. You could see like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Ezra Pound, T.E. Hume, Eliot, Yeats, right? All of them, those who wrote between 1910 to 1940. What it collectively we call as modernist poetry or modernism, right? So we have poetry, fiction, novel, drama, and simultaneously criticism, those who played their role. So one is to understand why the modernist literature was different. It challenged the previous conventions, structures, right, or the previous assessment of literature like symbolist and impressionistic criticism, right? So including T.S.Eliot comes there, where he just criticizes, it was a kind of a reaction against the impressionistic criticism of 1890s, 1880s, and 1890s. So in that perspective, we have to look at T.S.Eliot. Yeah, so that is the one important aspect. Now, before we go and look at some of his critical theories, or why Eliot, or for that matter, all other important critical thinkers, why they thought like that, what were the reasons which made them to think like that, right? For that, we have to simply, we have to go beyond literature, right? So first we have to understand that, the traditional definition of, how we approach. Please remember that, right? And listen, we are going to talk about some important topic where we might stand with a particular, standpoint. It might be possible that in next the lectures which we are going to start with 1920s, maybe by the time we reach 2000 or current critical theories, we might have taken a complete U-turn also. It could be a complete circle also, right? So in a sense, we have to understand the important reason, political, social, and cultural reasons, scientific reasons, which played a very important role in changing the perception of modernist thinkers, right? So when we start 20th century, when we say Eliot, right, modernism, right, and the different aspects of modernism, like for example, imagism, Dadaism, futurism, surrealism, which most of these emerged in paintings of the time, right, and well-known painters of the time, those who deliberately wanted to break away from the traditional method of interpreting literature, right? So what we have to understand, what was the reason why suddenly they thought like that? Without going into detail, remember that three important aspects we have to remember, right? We could say that yes, modernism began with that, right? Or imagism, right? Like Ezra Pound wanted to make it completely new, something new, right? The question is why? Or why Virginia Woolf or James Joyce or Kafka thought like that, right? For that, we have to, in a way, it's like saying why we think like that into, our perception. Today, someone the other day told me that people started thinking about the very purpose of education in this pandemic, right? In the COVID-19 situation with millions of, people suffering and death, we have started thinking the very purpose of life, very purpose of education itself. What is the use of all this at the end of the day if you can't really change someone's life in real life, day-to-day activity, right? Instead of talking about idealism. So what is the ultimate purpose? It make us think again. Yeah, so it could be, those could be the reasons. Historical, political, and cultural and scientific reasons play a very important role in uh, the understanding of the particular age, right? So every age has its um, has its what's called these kind of I mean historical and other reasons, right? If you go back to even history, you'll find from Renaissance, Reformation to many other such Enlightenment thinkers and others, which they played a very important role. So in that sense, when we are going to start with Eliot, right, which these ideas you should keep in mind from for Eliot, for I.A. Richards, and for F.R. Lewis too, right? Most important reason is, one of the important thing is, the industrial revolution began sometime around 1750s, right? And those by between 1820s to 1890s, miracles after miracles were produced, by scientific advancement. And particularly most important scientific advancement happened between 1890 to 1910. Yeah. Okay. If you look at, for example, right, when we say, right, I'll come back to that point. That point is the most important point rather. World War, I would say, First World War. First World War played a very important role. Right. Now, again, the basic question comes, why First World War, sir? Before that also, we had so many wars in this country, right, in this world, right? Okay, so if you go back to World War, right, and before that also, just before another 50 years ago, there was a Crimean War. Before that, French Revolution, right, and many other, we could say, yeah. So there were many other different like Crimean War or French Revolution and many other types of war to happen. So why First World War played a very important role, right? So now why First World War played a very important role? Let's look at why, the reason for that. So one of the most important reason was why First World War was called World War, or its impact was so devastating. We have to go back to the scientific advancement, right? Innovations after innovation, miracles after miracles were invented between those period, between 1890 to 1900. As far as military is concerned, I hope you know that submarines, aeroplanes, right, okay, were tank, machine guns, right, and all these weapons of mass destruction were invented. Right, brother, sometime around 1897 invented aeroplane, and by the time of 1907 and 1908, fighter planes were available. Got it? And another important, telegraph, right? Morse code, video camera. The camera as a invention of camera played a very important role. Radio played a very important role. Yeah. So if you look at why the effect of the World War I was so devastating, it is the reason why the very nature of World War was different, right? So its effect was entirely different. All right. So World War was one of the reasons. So Second World War or First World War, very important. And the another important was invention of scientific gadgets. All these played a very important role. And the third important was, development of modern psychology, right? Sometime around 1897, psychology as a discipline emerged. And by 1901, psychoanalysis as a discipline emerged, right? So if you look at modernist thinkers, whether philosophers, poets, artists, painters, everyone, right, these three important political and cultural events played a very important role in the formation of their ideas. In a way, in simple layman's language, they were able to conceive the world in a different way. Right, today as we conceive, right, just imagine how we conceive and perceive this world with so much of internet, technology, aeroplanes. We know the whole world, right? Almost we have reached the almost 90% of the whole world we have conquered. We know that, right? Even undersea, almost more than we are able to explore, and we know more about that, right? So in a way, so the perception of these writers altered. So that advancement of science and technology, development of modern psychology, psychoanalysis, right, and war, right? First World War played a very important role in the formation of all of them. And when we say war, right, I don't have time to explain the devastation, the horrors of World War, right? Remember that, got it? so in one line I could conclude why the previous war, we had so many, from French Revolution, glorious revolutions, 100 Years War, War of Roses, and American Civil War, American War of Independence, right? So many wars happened, but all the effect of those wars were very limited. Remember that, right? Those were traditional wars, right? Just go back 1865, right? American Civil War, 4 years happened, nothing happened, right? Not more than around 15 to 20,000 people died, right? The war was happening in Tennessee, Mississippi, Montana, the Western or Central America, but it did not affect other people, right? So the first important aspect is First World War's impact was devastating because of these reasons, right? Live telecast, we could say, if you go with that day's assessment, that day's criteria, because within 2-3 days photographs would appear in newspapers, right? Within 2-3 days, or within 3-4 hours, telegraph or Norse code, the devastations would appear, right? And people, right, so many countries and so many people never participated in such horror, right? Before that, just go back, Crimean War, 1853 or 1865, it was not possible for men to fly. Got it? You imagine, right? So that was a very important reason. So why World War played a very important role in the formation or assessment of all these modernist thinkers, right? But please imagine, that does not mean, that does not mean that those modernist thinkers soon after or during the First World War, they had the same kind of perception as the post, those writers of post World War II, right? Or current living authors, we could say, right? So there is a difference. What is the difference? As we proceed, you will see to that, right? So in a way, the perception played a very important role. How you see the world, how you conceive the world, right? Okay, just go back in history. It was a limited community where people stayed, and they just stayed and had their own life, not at all affected by the hurry of the life. Okay, and what's happening in the frontier or other areas, right? So that's a separate topic. When we deal with modernist literature, we'll see that why modernist literature conceived writing in that sense, or why what we find even in the poems of T.S.Eliot or E.W.B. Yeats or Ezra Pound or T.E.U., right? So the question is, when we are going to start with Eliot or all of these critical thinkers, this political, social, historical background is very important in understanding. The simple question is why they thought like that. The reason, right? Why same way? Why Matthew Arnold or Alexander Pope did not think like this? This is the simple question we should ask, right? So it's like saying that why we thought like that, right? So that's why, that is the main reason. So keeping this in mind, we have to look at Eliot, right? Eliot and all other modernist thinkers, right? And to understand modernism, right, or modernist literature, right, or all the 20th century criticism, right, whether you go for post-structuralism or deconstruction or the offshoot of the theories which emerged out of this, right, all the critical theories which had been popular, right, which had been in practice since 1850s, or we could say, right, for example, like feminism or psychoanalysis since the time of Sigmund Freud around 1901, or Marxist criticism since the time of Russian Revolution, right? Or in the same way, myth criticism around 1940s, okay? Or Marxist criticism, right? All of these critical theories, how it got affected and how it, how these critical theories, got affected by structuralist and or specifically or post-structuralist, right? So it's very important to understand that. Yeah, or some of the critical theories. For example, now Marxist theories have become like a post-Marxist or neo-Marxist, right? Okay, so psychoanalytical theories have become like Lacan uses for post-Freudian approach. All right, in the same way, feminist, right? We know that the different generation of feminist literary criticism, how 1920s Virginia Woolf, 1950s Simone de Beauvoir, and by 1970s radical feminist and others, how influenced by post-structuralist, how they altered or changed their perspective, right? Their approach towards gender and feminist, credentials. right? Or some of the critical theories which purely emerged out of that. That is also an entirely different one, right? So keeping this in mind, we are going to look at some of the important critical theories, right? And the relevance of those theories, okay, of during that time, that is in 1920s, or which paved the way for 20th century modern literary criticism. In that sense, the contribution of Eliot is very important, right? How he shaped or paved or unwittingly paved the way for the development of we could say development of Anglo-American neocriticism, we could say, right, and which played a very important role in 1930s, 40s, and 50s, right? And later, when structuralists by 1950s and 60s they take up, right, they again go back to Eliot, right? Or we'll see how post-structuralists like Roland Barthes or others are indebted, or as a students of literature, how we can never get rid of influence of Eliot. At least in some of those critical ideas, we are indebted to him, right? And let's look at some of his ideas, keeping in mind, right, the political, social, historical, and cultural reasons why Eliot conceived and formed those ideas, right? Okay, so keeping that in mind, we are going to look at Eliot's important critical ideas, like, for example, which we find in his essay "Tradition and Individual Talent," like idea like theory is theory of personality, a theory of impersonality, right? Is the role of history and role of tradition. Got it? Another famous essay we talks about objective correlative, right? In layman's language, exactly how he does the assessment of Shakespeare's very important play, and the same way how Eliot paved the way for a revival of metaphysical poets by informing us that, right, that metaphysical poets, how they have the so-called unification of sensibility, got it, and how they have a unification of sensibility and dissociation of sensibility in their works, and how these ideas and how these important points, concept played a very important role in the in the formation of 20th century literary criticism, right? Keeping this in mind, we are going to look at some of these ideas in simple layman's language, exactly what he means by that, got it? Whether he was, why he or she thought like that, he thought like that. That is one approach we are going to have it, right? So let's look at some of his essays, some important ideas. We'll discuss some of the core concept which he talks about. So shall we start? I'll put a important slide. You can note down some important points. As I've already explained to you, it's a very simple language. In layman's language, it's a demystified approach, right? Looking at criticism, literary criticism in 20th century, and all the criticism in a very simple layman's language, right? So we'll look at some of the important concepts of Eliot, right? Eliot was born in 1888 and died in 1965. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at, you can see that he was born on the same year when Matthew Arnold actually died. Okay, Arnold played a very important role in Eliot's perception, right? Though there are different ideas, there are some important points in which Eliot differs from Matthew Arnold, but the 19th century critic Matthew Arnold played a very important role in that sense. But if you go back, we go back and understand the whole of 20th century criticism, some way we go back and we end up with Matthew Arnold, who is in a way, who almost we could say that he was the first man who paved the way for formation of 20th century literary criticism, right? So in that sense, some of the important ideas of Eliot, right, was Arnold's influence can be seen there too, right? But at the same time, there are other ideas in which he differs and which he invented his own ideas and concept, right? And your understanding of Eliot would be better if we simultaneously keep in mind some of his important poems, right? Remember that he was in the line of all those great poet critic, right, like Philip Sidney, Dr. Johnson, okay, Matthew Arnold, right, even Coleridge, okay, Dryden, Alexander Pope, William Wordsworth. Okay, so in that sense, we have to look at Eliot and his important contribution towards 20th century criticism, we could say. So he played a very important role, right? At the very outset, if you look at, Eliot says that, criticism is defined is almost as a kind of a rational analysis of literature. Yeah, in a way, you could see that the importance of reason, right? Reason is very important. We must do a scientific analysis. Literature can be, right, analyzed. Criticism can be analyzed as a scientific activity, right? So the meaning is, before that, it was not scientific. Got it? Why was it like that? So we have to think of impressionistic criticism, right? Look at the very word, impressionistic criticism. It says that impression plays a very important role. 1860s, 70s, and 80s. You remember that 1859, 60, when Rossetti and all the poets, the Free Raphaelite group, they started writing, and the influence of that can be seen in writings of Walter Peter, A.C. Swinburne. Correct? Impressionistic criticism, those who give importance to individual impression of a work, right? Individually, that is an individual, how you perceive a work, how you conceive a work, right? That's a different thing. Remember that in 1920s we are talking about, we'll come back to 2000, in 1980. We might be going back, and again we might be saying that, oh, today we are saying that, oh, Eliot was so critical of impressionistic criticism. We might come back to one of the offshoot of post-structuralism, like reader response criticism. We might be going back again to that. We could say that we might be completing a complete full circle as far as these critical theories are concerned, right? So individual impression of a work, but of course reader response criticism, it's a text-based approach. Impressionistic criticism is not about text-based approach, rather it was how an individual perceives or conceives a poem or a poetry or a painting. Yeah, so individual impression was important, right? It was not scientific, right? If a person reads a poem, he or she feels very good. Yeah, feel good, super, excellent, nice. Yeah, it's a good, right? Another person might read, he or she might not feel. A person might see a painting, she might feel like that, but the other person might not. So it was not scientific. So Eliot was against this impressionistic criticism, right? And as I already told you, right, the World War 1914 World War has started. Got it? Right. The essay was written in 1919, but the influence, we could see that two important critics, those who played a very important role, like T.E. Hume, right, whose influence can be seen here, right? So in a way, how Eliot's understanding and perception has changed because of all these reasons, right? The development of modern psychoanalysis and psychology and psychoanalysis as a discipline, right? Okay, and scientific advancements, right? And the World War and the horrors of World War, right? And the horrors of World War has challenged the traditional notion and of which notion and ideologies and ideologies which were cherished for almost 200 years since the time of Enlightenment thinkers. Okay, ideas like reason, logic, common sense, right? Discipline, punctuality, common goodness, justice, liberty, all such ideas, right? The World War I has demonstrated that all those ideas were not at all universal in a way, in that sense, right? So the perception, it played a very important role. So the perception has changed. So Eliot looks at literature not from the impressionistic criticism perspective, right? He like the other critics of the time, he wanted to make it scientific. Right? Criticism should be scientific. And when we say scientific, we know that science, in simple layman's language, what is science? If a person does something, the scientific is when whatever the activity we do, right, it produces the same result for everyone in simple layman's language. There's a switchboard. If I switch on, the light will, glow. And if another person does also, it will do the same thing, right? So whatever the physical atmosphere condition, electrical, etc., if it's a perfect, it will produce the same result, right? But literature wasn't like that, right? So because impressionistic criticism paved the way for personal narrative, personal impressions. So Eliot was against that, right? I think I've explained some of the important critics of the time, like Arthur Symonds, Walter Peters, Swinburne. Eliot called it imperfect criticism, okay? He called it imperfect because an individual's personal impressions can neither be universal nor or unbiased or unprejudiced, right? So he wanted to bring in a set of standards, right? A very scientific analysis of literature. All right. So we could see emergence of imagism and other, and how he forms that, right? So we could anticipate the coming of new critical ideas, and simultaneously the Russian formalist or Anglo-American new critics, those who came into scene in 1920s, right? So he was wanted to create a standard for evaluation, right? So criticism is a very evaluative work, and critic or reader, he or she must do evaluation in the same procedure, same way, right? It cannot be individualistic or impressionistic criticism. So he found it is a kind of a faulty approach, okay, imperfect criticism. That's why he wrote, criticism is the disinterested exercise of intelligence, right? It is a disinterested exercise, unprejudiced, objectivity, right? We should not forget that the same idea he must have been borrowed or influenced by Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold talks about the same thing in the 1860s, 1870s, when he says that, right? When he says that we should not commit the mistake of historical fallacy, right? Judging a work of art by going after the history of the time, or personal estimate, he calls historical estimate and personal estimate, okay? And where he says that how a poet's work should be judged by the work itself, right? Got it? Or so that is what he says that. So in a way, disinterested endeavor of the best that has been thought and said in the world. That is what Matthew Arnold referred. So Eliot must have been influenced by that. Yeah, that objectivity is very important in literary in criticism, right? It is a disinterested exercise. There's no place for personal prejudice, right? So, like I.A. Richards, Eliot wanted to bring objectivity in literature, right? Like that of a scientist, zoologist, or botanist, right? I've explained to you how this was possible. Got it? So you could see the influence of the political, social, and cultural event, that they were able to see that literature was there was a degeneration, kind of a decadence, right? So let's make it very very classic in a sense, very almost like a science. Got it? Okay, and we know that by the time T.H. Hume, another proponent of classicism, right? In fact, he played a very important role. The influence, we could see that T.H. Hume was a he fought in First World War and died in 1917. He wrote a very famous essay, Romanticism and Classicism, in 1914, right, which paved the way for the formation of imagism. Or in fact, he was the first one. In fact, he wrote the first or the second poem of of Imagist poem. Right, so imagism played imagism and influence of T.H. Hume was almost, we could see, in T.S.Eliot, right? So it was against romanticism, right? When we say romanticism, means the so-called romantic literature, Wordsworth, Coleridge, right? Those who talked about expressing individual emotions, right? Like Wordsworth's famous definition of spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? So in a way, we get the idea that Eliot was completely against romantics, right? Got it? So please remember these points, so that we could, as we proceed, we will understand some of the other critical ideas too, right? That's why Eliot openly described himself, right? Remember that a very famous line which he mentioned in his very famous essay, right? A classicist in literature, he called himself, a royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. Right. Remember that, first of all, Eliot was not a great philosopher. He was not a very controversial. He was not an atheist. Okay. He was a very religious man. Got it? Many times we get confused by Eliot and his poem. Right. Of course, remember that this was his personal life. In a poetry, he was for classicism. Right. Of course, the great classical authors and the imitation of those classical authors, but not in a sense of Dryden and Pope. Right. A royalist in politics, believing in royalism, right? Believing in the conservative royal kings, right? Okay, that kind of politics. And in religion, Anglo-Catholic, right? He adopted Catholicism, right? He converted to that after his, departure from, after he immigrated from US, right? Okay, so he was a religious man, okay? And in the midst of World War, in the midst of chaos, he was expecting poetry to be very precise and do many other activities. Yeah, got it. And in a way, he believes that a time would come, poetry would do that, right? Okay, but still, there is a nostalgia. There is a regret, right? And the whole of modernist literature described in that sense, right? They have not completely abandoned the ideas. They have not completely abandoned all these grand thoughts of enlightenment and other thinkers. Please remember that. Though the world war was going on, right, they did not lose hope. Okay, so that is what the idea we get. They might feel as if, oh, the world has become absurd, the world has become wasteland, right? Okay, the world has become meaningless in a sense, but still there's a possibility of hope, right? So this is about personally about Eliot's, his own life. So the concept which we are going to discuss is, is theory of objective correlative, right, which he talks about in his very famous essay, Hamlet and his problem. Got it? And another important concept which he talks about is unification of sensibility, right, and disassociation of sensibility, which he talks about, where he almost played a very important role and revived the whole of what we call metaphysical poets. Okay, and the third one is most important essay is theory of concept of tradition, right? So in layman's language, we have to understand in what sense he talks about in that essay, tradition and individual talent, the concept of tradition. What it and tradition and individual talent, as the title suggests, right? Okay, and the individual talent, or that of an individual's impression or individual's contribution, we could say, or individual's personality, right? Or how a poet should combine tradition with that of his own personality, his own ideas, or his theory of personality, we could say. And overall, as a Eliot as a critic, right? Eliot as a critic, what are the roles he played at that time, right? And today, after at the hindsight, after 100 years, we could look at his contribution, right? And how much he played and shaped the way for subsequent theories, right? And in that sense, all the other theories which emerged, in what way they are indebted to him, or in what sense, the role he played during that time, right? Particularly 1920s and 30s and 40s. Okay, you should remember that. I hope he lived for almost till 1965, even after the World War II, right? So we could ask the question of, he came up with all these great ideas, right? But at the same time, after the World War II, right, we don't find any kind of, we don't find any kind of wasteland, right? That's a different thing. So we have to look at like that. Okay, so let's look at some of his important critical ideas, right? Before we go for tradition, his concept of tradition and his impersonality, let's look at his idea of objective correlative, right, which he talks about in his essay Hamlet and his problem, right? It's a very famous essay. All of us must have studied, right? And please remember that our approach should be, remember that nothing is absolute, right? These ideas which he expressed at the time, there were other critics, those who criticize him, and today also we can look at very objectively. We could say that yes, Eliot was correct, right? Eliot was correct, or we could say that, like today, no, we can never arrive at whether he was correct or not, right? It's not even possible, right? So let's look and understand what he meant by that, right? We could challenge some of his ideas. We could say no, yeah, even there's a possible that there could be a great work of art or a literature, right? Or you could say product of any social or political what we call the age might produce anything without even objective correlative also, right? So we have to look at very critically, right? Need not we may agree with some of his ideas, right? But understand exactly in what sense he or she wanted to express his ideas, right? Hamlet and his problem, right? So one of the most important idea what we come to know here is objective correlative, right? Which was written in his famous essay Hamlet and his problem. Look at the very title, says that Hamlet and his problem, right? The protagonist, the character Hamlet, right? Though it talks about the character Hamlet, right? But if you go and read the essay, it talks about even the play, right? Though the title actually it should have been Hamlet and its problem, the play's problem. But here, Hamlet talks about Hamlet as a drama, but at the same time, the title is Hamlet and his problem, the protagonist, the character Hamlet also. Later, it was published in The Sacred Wood, also the essay, right? And one of the very important ideas which which he expressed almost he calls it an artistic failure, right? He called it at the time, right? Today we might not agree with that, right? There are critics those who don't agree with that. So we could say that Hamlet, he says that Hamlet is certainly an artistic failure. We'll see that what was the reason why he calls it an artistic failure, right? At the time he said that there were critics those who agree with that. Got it? Okay, so he says that it does not have objective correlative, right? Okay, so the objective correlative is missing in Hamlet. That's why, though it is the Mona Lisa of literature, though he calls that too, right? It is the Mona Lisa of literature. It is the most important artistic work. It's a great work, but at the same time, the play lacks objective correlative, right? So in simple language, what is objective correlative? What we have to look at, right? In simple language, we'll come back to that. First, let's look at how he defines that, right? So before that, let's look at, Eliot begins this essay by stating that, the problem of Hamlet is actually, he says that actually, Hamlet is a very popular play, right? We all like Hamlet. So he says that the play itself has a lot of problem, right? And the main character, the character Hamlet's problem is secondary only, right? Eliot, he says that why people give more importance to Hamlet, the character, right? Invariably, we are attracted towards Hamlet. We call it Hamlet, the so-called themes, procrastination, indecisiveness, right? Of course, there are many themes, right? But that's another topic, that why procrastination or indecisiveness has become the core theme, right? Today we cannot say that one of the important, two important critics, the romantic critics, German critic like Goethe and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. S.T. Coleridge played a very important role. They say that why, we were fascinated towards Hamlet, and Hamlet's personality, his soliloquies, indecisiveness, his incestuous feeling, his suicide tendencies, etc., etc. He blames them, for these critics, right? Because he says that most of these, biographical critics, they created Hamlet out of their own personality. So he accuses them of saying that, right? And he says that for the long time, almost for 200 years, that is the approach we had. And most of the time, authors and critics, they put on their own perception, their own understanding, and their own personality into Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? Without looking at, the play as an artistic work, right? So he says that they were fascinated because they found their own personality, their own dilemmas, problems, right? And today also, we are fascinated towards Hamlet because we find, oh, we have our own problem, to be or not to be, right? All right, and we see that parallel in our own activity. We find, oh, Hamlet too had all those problems, right? That's the universal aspect of Shakespeare's Hamlet. We attach with that, right? Because we are attracted towards the play because of its emotions, personal emotions, sentiments, right? Not because the play is, good or perfect, or it is artistically, it's a very, very good work, but it has attracted you emotionally, sentimentally, right? So that is the main reason. And he says that in forming Hamlet's character like that, these critics were were a reason for that, right? Eliot wrote that due to their fixation of Hamlet rather than the play as a whole, right, it led to the most misleading kind of criticism possible, right? So what happened? We were more fascinated towards, towards what we call, we just carried away by, the emotions of the play, right? Of the play or the drama. I'll give you an example. We watch so many movies. Okay, we watch so many movies. We just like, if it's a love movie, love deals with love or emotion or a sentiment or family movie, right? Got it? We don't go and dissect it. We simply like it, right? We simply like it. We don't go and find out whether how much the movie's artistic benefit, etc. You take just so many Rajnikant's movie, I find like that, and there is a very famous Hindi movie also, right? One of the classic, and no one raises the question, right? If you look at Sholay, right, in Hindi films, Sholay is always promoted as if one of the grand. But if you go and dissect the movie, you will find that Sholay was a literally copy of all those Western, those spaghetti Western movies of 1960s, right? Italian and Hollywood movies. They copied every scene from there. Nothing is, original in that sense, right? So it's the same way if you look at the famous movies of Rajnikant also, right? So what happens? We get carried away by that. There are very famous songs also. You listen to the song, you emotionally like the song, right? But if you look at artistically, if you analyze the musical instrument, the other part, other aspect of the music would not be so good, but it pleases us. And since it pleases us, we stop doing that. And same thing happened in literature also in same way. There are so many literary great works. If you look at same way, one of the very famous important novel or literature was, that what's called this, Oliver Goldsmith's novel, right? Vicar of Wakefield, right? Vicar of Wakefield was a very popular novel actually. Okay, people liked it. It sold like hotcake. Okay, and people simply liked the sentiments in the novel, right? So from 1769 till 20th century, no one critically analyzed the novel, right? Because it's always famous, right? It's like saying that today, how many people would go and do the analysis of Rajnikant's Pasha or if some of his gangster movies, right? Because they cannot do that. Hegemonic power won't allow that. We know that how the Indian film industries work, right? If you do that, you will be sent out, you will be thrown away, right? Okay, and we don't have time to discuss more on that. You could imagine. But if you go and do all these Indian Hollywood, Indian movies of, this gangster movies, all of them were copied from one of the greatest movies like Godfather 1, 2, and 3. They simply copied it, whether in Indian, Hindi, Tamil, Malayalam, you'll find that, right? And Rajnikant did the same thing, Amitabh Bachchan did the same thing. They simply copied it, and today also they copy. Once they used to copy like this, right? One movie. Today what they do, they copy from 5 movies, 6 movies, got it? So nothing original. I mean, at least there was one Tamil director, at least he acknowledged that no one can make a gangster movie in India or throughout the world without acknowledging his, how indebted he or she is to Godfather series, right? So in that sense, what happens? The same way with Vicar of Wakefield. For 200 years, people admired it till the time 1920s when Henry James dissected it and they found that most of the plots were contrived, artificial, sentimental. Copies were lifted from the other novels of the time of 1750s and 60s, of those Gothic novels also, right? And sentimental scenes were misleading, got it? And since it was very popular, people stopped dissecting it. Yeah, it's like saying the equivalent of what I told about movies. Very popular movie, people would not do that, right? You take so many movies are there, right? Got it? You take very popular movies, even Hindi movies, right? How many of they literally do that? They cannot do that, right? The critics aren't doing the duty. That's the biggest problem. So same thing with Hamlet. He says that Hamlet's character was created like this. He blames Coleridge and Goethe for creating, because they found their own personal problem, their own imagination, and some characteristics in Hamlet, and they created Hamlet like that. So what happened? The play as an as a complete as a structure was never analyzed, right? And critics and people were always attracted towards the character Hamlet. So he says that there is a defect in the play, but critics never understood that. So it led to the misleading kind of criticism, right? He said that's why Eliot goes back to the original theme of Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? He says that some of the original plays from which he borrowed the story, he says that the original plays, the original theme were entirely different, right? They, those were simply, revenge was the only theme, right? If you go back to Thomas Kitt's Spanish tragedy or other plays, right? Somewhere during the line, what happened? Different other themes started dominating it, right? Got it? So the original work, revenge was only theme, right? Got it? But even in the other original play, madness was used as a disguise only, so that it could, Hamlet could escape from suspicion. That was the main reason, right? Okay. Now, so in that sense, he said that he conclude by saying that what was the reason, right? Why critics did not analyze Shakespeare's Hamlet as a play, going after his artistic merit, rather going after the character, his personality, his disposition towards what's called suicide, his incestuous feeling towards his mother, right? And why the core theme, the one theme with which he was supposed to take revenge of his father, murder of his father, was abandoned, right? Got it? So even we feel as if, right, we are made to believe that somewhere the revenge theme is missing, and this indecisiveness has taken the main center stage, right? Got it? Now Now Eliot goes after this and he says that, it's an artistically, it's a failed one. That's it. That's why when I begin this essay, this talk, I told you this assessment of that Hamlet was, or Shakespeare was not able to convey exactly what's the emotion he or she wanted to convey through Hamlet. We will never know, right? Or we will never understand. We will never know really what he wanted to convey. But assuming that Eliot's premises, Eliot says that Shakespeare was not able to convey exactly what is the emotion he wanted to convey through Shakespeare, Shakespeare's character Hamlet, right? So in a way, what happened? Hamlet, the character, is not able to express through actions or through concept, through what's called this, other sensory, feelings and emotions, exactly his real emotion. That is what, right? That is what he says. Shakespeare failed to do that, right? So in a way, it appears as if Shakespeare wanted to convey Hamlet as a mad character, but somewhere he is unable to convey that through actions. So in a way, basically what he says that if Shakespeare wanted to convey Hamlet as a mad character, he should have shown through actions, through situation, through music, through drama, through the physical and emotional setting, right? So Shakespeare, we know that he quotes his own play. Eliot quotes Shakespeare another play, Macbeth, and he says that how in Macbeth, right? And Macbeth, this was shown through objective correlative, right? So he says that if the object was to convey emotions of madness, this was not shown to the audience on this stage, right? Or through words, or through gestures, or through a stage setting. This was lacking, right? That is what he says, assuming that we should assume that yes, Shakespeare wanted to convey that, or we assume that as Eliot assumes, right? Shakespeare wanted to convey madness, right? As a as a device, as a madness, as a character he wanted to convey. So Eliot concludes by saying that it is because Shakespeare cannot find a sufficient objective correlative for his hero, the audience is left without a means to understand an experience that Shakespeare himself does not seem to understand. 20th century might question, how would we know that what Shakespeare wanted to convey, right? So Eliot says that Shakespeare himself does not seem to understand what kind of a character he or she wanted to convey, right? So he says that he did not know exactly what kind of a character, whether he wanted to show the revenge as a main theme, main emotion, or his love for Ophelia, or his love for his mother, or love for his brother, or his father, the ghost, or his inability in doing this, or his passion for getting the the correct reasons for murder of Claudius, right? So assuming Shakespeare, Eliot says that he did not know exactly which emotion should dominate the character, right? So that's why the objective correlative is missing in Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? Okay, so that's why he says that it lacks that aspect compared to Shakespeare's another play, Macbeth, right? Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth becomes mad, her madness is shown to the audience through her sleepwalking scene. She never comes and says that she has become mad, right? Of course, that's a very good definition. That's a very good idea. In a movies or in a film or in a stage, you must show. You should not speak. Writer should not speak. Dramatist should not speak. He must show through act, right? Even in films it play a very important role. Filmmakers should show, right? He or she should not let the character speak, right? That's a good thing. But here the question is, Eliot, we going with Eliot, he says that it seems that Shakespeare himself does not know what is the emotion he wanted to convey, right? That's why the objective correlative, that is the character's behavior on the stage, his behavior and his action and his talk, it does not correlate. Look at the way. So he says that the only way of expressing emotion in a form of art is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of object. It could be situation. It could be chain of event, right? Which shall be a formula for particular emotions, right? So he says that in a way you want to show kind of a stormy night, right? You want to show the inner turmoil of a particular character, right? You want to show that. How would you show? Show through actions. right? You know that Indian films and many of our movies, they show that stormy night, rain, right? Most of the time, if you look at Indian movies, when lovers meet, when the tragedy happens, death happens, it would be night time, electricity would be off, full of rain, right? Okay, very tragic scenes, all of these, right? So because now the question is, why should it happen like that? That's a different question, right? But our filmmakers, from canonical text, we all got this idea, right? Oh, tragedy means, this should happen, right? Tragedy means all this kind of activity should happen. So that's the formula, right? Eliot is a classicist. We believe in those classical ideology, classical myth of, yeah, this is the way it should be shown, right? We agree with that, yes. As far as critics are, they agree, yes, it is, it should be there. But the question, again, the critics they ask is Eliot's own assessment of that. How would we conclude that Eliot exactly wanted to convey the particular emotion, right? That's an entirely different thing that we are unable to understand even after 500 years exactly what was Hamlet's problem. And that's why still research is going on. That's why still we read Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? It does not become absolute because it does not fall into that. That's a different thing in a way. So he says that there should be some kind of object, right, where the characters should be able to show through act or object or a situation or even chain of event or their own personal behavior, right, the particular emotion, right? And this is that Shakespeare's Hamlet, it is lacking, right? So we are confused. As a reader, what we find is that we doubt whether he was really mad or not, even today, right? So there are critics those who say no, he was really mad, he was pretending. There are others who say no, he has really become mad. Whether he really loved Ophelia, we don't know, right? Of course, we don't get answers for all these, right? That's why rather it confuses us, right? Or should we say the duty of literature is to confuse, right? If you go back and if you go and see new critics, they would say yes, the duty of literature, the very characteristic of literature is to confuse, right? That new critics, they talk about four important things. If you want to write a poem, you must have ambiguity, tension, paradox, irony, right? And if you go with the Russian formalist definition, again, yes, the very purpose of writing poetry, literature is to confuse, right? So in layman's language, if you don't want to confuse, why should you write poetry? Right? You want to convey some, no, I want to convey some great information, sir. Yeah, better write a newspaper article. No, I want to say convey fact. Oh, write history. No, I want to convey some good message. Please do the advice, do sermoning. Don't write poetry. Don't write novels. So if you go to new critics, when we come to new critics, we'll discuss about that in that sense, in that context, right? So here the question is, but for the same reason, we could say that we are still reading Shakespeare's Hamlet. So look at, now we quote Shakespeare's Macbeth. He says that how, right, if you examine any of Shakespeare's most successful tragedies, you will find that exact equivalence. You will find that the state of mind of Lady Macbeth's walking in sleep has been communicated to you by skillful accumulation of imagined sensory impressions, right? And he says that we get the sensational feeling that yes, he has become mad, right? And soon after, later, when Macbeth listens, when he hears the news of his wife's death, the way he replies, the way he acts, the way he reacts, make us believe that yes, it's a very genuine one, right? In 1920s, we could say that. Now in 20th century, you might ask, no, sir, in my culture, I listen to my near one's death and this is the way I behave, I cry, they react. This cannot be universal, right? I might not do the same thing, got it? In 20th century, maybe after 100 years, we could say, right? Okay, but we have to understand that Eliot is somewhat still traditional. Okay, he goes along with, remember that he believes in all those grand ideologies, of Enlightenment thinkers. Okay, right? He is not a postmodernist. Please remember that. Okay, he's not Nietzsche or he's not Kierkegaard. Remember that. Okay, Eliot is still, as in those three lines, three phrases of one line, it communicates, right? He still believed that those grand idealisms. Remember that, right? And so those grand idealism which he believed that the whole of Victorian age and neoclassical age had, or going back to past, since Homer or Dante's time, right, or Spencer's time, we find all of that in his work, like we could say that what the protagonist Tiresias speaks in his Wasteland. He believed in all those ideologies, right? Of course, he speaks through different characters like love, J. Alfred Prufrock in that famous love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in his poem, and in Tiresias, through Tiresias in the Wasteland. But what we assume is he still believed in all those. And since those grand idealisms were crumbling, yeah, remember that it was World War was going on. And by 1924 itself, people started anticipating the coming of Second World War. 1924, that Russia, Lenin died, and after that Stalin, took over. By 1926, Stalin became dictator, right? And by 1924 and 27, 28, even the emergence of Mussolini and Hitler, right? And by 1921, Hitler almost took over the German Nazi party. So he could see that the coming of World War II also. So the World War I, the devastations, right? Please remember that more than 7.5 million people, lost their lives. Okay, so almost, they got amputated. More than 1 crore died. 7.5, that is 75 lakh people lost their limbs. So the devastation of World War was very, it was very shock, right? Horror, right? And the whole 20 years of, this between World War I and II, the literature of the period reflects that. So in a way, what Eliot was seeing is, he felt as if, the old grand ideas were crumbling, but still he has not lost hope, right? So keeping this in mind, he believes that, yeah, right, the works, ideas, grand ideas, if a critic or if a writer conceives, he must communicate in a particular way. So in a way, he criticizes. So in a way, in simple language, he says, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, Shakespeare knew what he wanted to convey. So he showed us in action through those objective correlative. But in Macbeth, it seems that he does not know that, right? He was not able to express that, right? Artistic inevitability lies in this complete adequacy of the external to the emotion, and this is precisely what is deficient in Hamlet, right? Okay, Hamlet, he says, is a man dominated by emotion, which is inexpressible because it is the excess of fact as they appear, right? Okay, remember that he is a modernist. Modernist critic talks about, right, at the time. As a post-structuralist, many of these assumptions can be questioned, right? We will never know exactly whether those facts, what they appear, and whether those emotions were excessive, right? We don't know, right? So he says that the supposed identity of Hamlet with this author is genuine to this point, that Hamlet's bafflement at the absence of objective equivalent to his feeling is a prolongation of a bafflement of his creator in the face of an artistic problem. Right? Look at, he says, so he says that Shakespeare himself had a problem. What kind of a character he or she wanted to convey? Remember that, Eliot as a, modernist, right, believing in those grand ideology, believing in the, grand narrative. Of course, in his work, we find from fragments to many other aspects, but still, he believed that, so Shakespeare is unable to conceive a character. In that sense, it shows that the character himself does not know exactly what he wants, or in the same way, the bafflement of the creator itself, right? In a way, Shakespeare himself has a problem. What type of a character, Hamlet, what type of a emotion or a character he wanted Hamlet to dominate, right? Look at, the way he describes, as if exactly he went into the mind of Shakespeare, assuming that Shakespeare is one person. Today we have scholarship, those who question the very assessment of Shakespeare as a one person also, right? So this is the approach, this is the way he looks at like that, right? So in spite of all this, he says that, people like Hamlet, right? Because, they consider it is a work of art because it is interesting. It is very interesting. It gives them, almost, make them happy, right? Not the other way around, right? Okay. So in spite of all this, he calls it Mona Lisa of literature. So he says that because of all this defect also, in spite of this defect, right, people liked and enjoyed Hamlet because they always found their own mirror, right? Most of the time, even today, when we read, we find our own problems, right? We replace with that problem, right? To be or not to be, what to do, right? So we found this interesting because, yeah, since it's very interesting, it's a good work of art, right? Not the other way around, right? So the other way around is, according to Eliot, you might not be interested, right? For example, you might read a poem or a novel which is not at all, emotionally and or intellectually might attract you, but still you should consider that as a great work of art, right? And if you'll be able to do that analysis and assessment only if you analyze it scientifically. Got it? The meaning is, in simple layman's language, we should be able to appreciate any novel or a poem, right, which might not express our opinion. Meaning, you should be able to appreciate a love movie. You might, but in real life, you might not believe in love. You might not have any interest in love. You don't even believe the concept of love, right? Same way, you might, you should be able to enjoy a religious movie, but you might be an atheist, right? That is what, in a way, he says that though emotionally and sentimentally it should not attract a person, but still we should be able to look at that as a work of art, right? So we could anticipate, the coming of new criticism, right? Intentional fallacy, affective fallacy, later they talked about, right? We'll see to that how all these ideas were carried forward by other critics, right? So that is what is lacking according to him, right? So in that state, right? Okay, so he goes on to explain that how Shakespeare was not able to exactly explain, whatever the emotions he had. So that was something is lacking, right? Eliot does, however, give credit to Shakespeare's use of objective correlative in his other works. As an example, Lady Macbeth's famous scene, right? He says that is what it's all about, right? So in a way, in simple language, he says that as a writer, yeah, as a dramatist, right, or as a filmmaker, we should be able to express whatever the emotions we as a writer, okay, he or she wants to express through the character's actions, right, or the situation, or the or the interplay. If it's a drama, the setting, right, but it not in just words, right? Okay, because words play a very limited role as far as films and such visual medias are concerned, right? So that is the core concept. So it confuses in Shakespeare's Hamlet, he says, right? We never know which emotions dominate. So in that sense, he blames even William Wade Wordsworth, William Shakespeare himself, by saying that it seems that Shakespeare himself did not know, right, what emotion he wanted the character to dominate, right? Unlike other characters, other plays, particularly like Shakespeare's, Macbeth, where he was completely able to express that opinion, right? So that is about objective correlative, right? In simple layman's language, that is what, as a playwright, you could see that, how these ideas are entirely different from the preceding ideas, right? So how he brings in objectivity, right? Okay, impressionistic criticism did not talk about that. Now, if you analyze with impressionistic criticism, you would say, yeah, the previous assessment of that. Oh, yes, I like it. Oh, Hamlet is like my character. I also have the same problem. My father's ghost, murder, incest, love, right? Unable to decide, right? My mother married within 2 months, with my uncle. All such emotions. So people, what would happen? People would invariably, they will relate their own life, right? And it would lead to impressionistic criticism, where the assessment of a work would be done by one's individual impression, personal assessment, personal emotions, feelings, right? Got it? Okay, so that is the reason. So he says that that's a fallacy, that's a wrong method. So that is what Goethe and Coleridge did, right? Rather, we should analyze Shakespeare's work based on artistic merit, right? Going beyond the emotions, personals, sentiments, right? Because if we carried away by sentimentality, again, because then the universality would lose, right? I hope you know the difference between sentiments and sentimentalities. Sentiments should be there in the plays or in a poem, novel, film, drama, but sentimentality is not good. Sentimentality is, when emotions, when they try to titillate, right, provoke you, right? Okay, when they provoke, the play or a drama or a novel, when they provoke you, right? For example, if a movie, when you watch a movie, you start feeling like crying, right? They make you cry, again it becomes a sentimental, right? You become very emotional, right? Again it leads to sentimentality, right? Because all of these are temporary emotions, they deal with that particular moment, right? But they won't be universal, right? As we proceed, we'll see that how he or she, how Eliot want the writers to deal with the so-called core emotions, right? Or the so-called tradition, what he talks about. Later we'll see that, we'll try to relate with that. So here we can see that by bringing in this objective correlative, he wanted, right, the playwright or the critic to analyze a work based on this objective correlative, right? So in that sense, it is almost like bringing scientific, assessment to criticism. Before that, till that time, it wasn't, right? You go back again, just go back like impressionistic critics, right? 1890s, 1860s, pre-Raphaelites, okay, critics like Matthew Arnold, 1860, 1870. All these were just personal and personal and very what's called this impressionistic and personal criticism, right? All of them, they analyzed the work based on their personal emotions, right? It was not objective, right? Either we went to biographical details or we went to historical context, or for example, we read Dover Beach, right? We go and read the 1860s history, right? History of the world, Charles Darwin, religious conflict, right? Love, etc., etc., right? Or we might go to the personal life, go to romantic poets, we go to the personal life of these poets, or in biographical criticism. So before 20th century, criticism was always historical, biographical, right? And in short, like new critics, they say it was, outside the text, right? They did not concentrate on the text that is what is available on the page, words written on the page, right? That was the reason. So this was one of the essays where he says, where we could see is scientific, way of assessment, where objective correlative, he puts that, right? Okay. And I think of what the critics talked about this essay, we have already explained, right? We know that, right? How those who raise question at the time itself, people, those who raise question, right? And particularly, there wasn't any objection that such kind of emotions which is shown to the shown on the stage as far as objective correlative is concerned, but only is how can we be sure about what is the emotion of the particular character or even the creator, right? Right. Eliot has come to the come to the question of even as if saying that he exactly knew exactly what Shakespeare wanted to convey, right? 20th century, you could say, leave about Shakespeare, even the character itself, the character Hamlet itself, how can we be sure that the character had, or he or she has that emotion, right? Okay, so it has come to that stage. So in that sense, we could question that aspect, right?